I am Dr. Denise Johnson with over 28 years of practice in the field of psychology with a mostly inner city African American population. And I want to talk to you today about how my experiences in the profession have taught me to challenge history. Don't get me wrong. During my 28 years in practice, I have observed the invaluable benefits that psychological services have made to hundreds of clients. When done in a culturally competent manner, psychological services can improve the quality of life and assist one in reaching their full potential. However, it is equally true that the history of psychology and many current practices in psychology erroneously conclude that African Americans are inferior intellectually, in personality, in parenting, and in all aspects of life. So I and many Black psychologists, social workers, and educators have challenged history for decades because we believe that these erroneous negative conclusions reflect the racism that's inherent in psychology and mental health, rather than reflecting the true status of African American people or people of color. And in October of 2021, the American Psychological Association, or the APA, which is the main organization that oversees and sets the standards for the field of psychology, finally formally responded as an organization when they issued an apology letter to people of color for the field's contribution to racism, discrimination, and to the oppression of people of color. And if you would like the background information to be able to read about this apology letter, along with all the references, I'm going to direct you to Google the American Psychological Association apology letter to people of color, and then Google the American Psychological Association apology letter to the people of color dash historical chronology, and again, American Psychological Association apology to people of color dash dismantling systemic racism. And you'll be able to do all of the background reading for the things that I'm going to be talking about today. All right, so my goal for today is to give you some information so that you can challenge history yourself if you're a Black person or a person of color and you or a loved one find yourself having negative consequences because of the result of a psychological evaluation. All right, one of the main problems in the field of psychology is that psychological theories, which tell us what is considered good or normal behavior, and which tell us what is considered to be good or normal mental health, these things are conceptualized from a dominant culture, middle class perspective, and not from the perspective, values, experiences, or strengths of people of color. So the first biased model that predominated the psychological literature and research was the genetic or the eugenic model. And this model was influential in the early 1900s when some psychologists, some of whom also held high positions in the APA and in other national offices, eugenics and a genetic model believed that racial group differences were due to the genetic superiority of the dominant culture and due to the genetic inferiority of people of color. During that period of time, there was a lot of talk about how the genetically inferior would taint the racial stock of the country. There was a lot of talk about how people who were genetically inferior were causing all of the ills in society. And because of those things, psychology at that time in the country at large had an investment in needing to limit, control, and monitor people that they considered to be genetically inferior for what they considered to be the good of society. And some of this monitoring also included sterilization laws. All right, the second biased model that dominated psychological literature and research was the cultural deficit model. And this model became popular around the 1960s. And what it said is that the inferior performance of diverse groups was based upon those groups having a depraved or deprived social, cultural, or economic environment in comparison to dominant culture, middle class individuals. All right, moving along, I'm going to say that the next main model that I'm going to talk about is called the multicultural model. And this first became popular, I'm going to say, around the 1970s and 1980s. And what the multicultural model recognized is that different cultures differ in worldview, values, thinking, and behavior because of the fact that the groups have different histories, the groups have different family life, and the groups have different societal circumstances. All cultures were considered to have strengths, and no one culture was considered to be better than another. After this time, I'm going to say psychology and a lot of other mental health professionals began to draft ethical codes and guidelines that encouraged professionals to consider and incorporate cultural factors into their treatment and evaluation of diverse groups. So, if we have all this going on, if there's a change towards the multicultural model and the drafting of all these ethical principles and codes in relation to incorporating multicultural issues into treatment, so the question remains, why was there still racism in the field of psychology? Why did that continue? And I want to give you some basic reasons why I think that that's true, why it still continued. The first one is that a lot of psychological practices and policies have a lot of seemingly race-neutral rules and regulations that they go by. So one of the biggest tools for propagating these race-neutral procedures is the tool of using the dominant culture as the standardization group or the standardization norms for behavior. So what this means is that most of the psychological tests that people take, even today, the way someone gets a score is that their behavior is compared to what they consider to be the normative group. And this normative group is made up primarily of dominant culture, middle class individuals. And so what this means is that the behavior of the dominant middle class is considered normal, and the behavior of all other people is considered not normal to the extent that it differs from whatever the normal middle class norms are. Okay, another example of why racism continues in psychology is because if we look at parenting, I'm going to say most norms about what we consider to be acceptable parenting here in America are based upon, again, dominant culture, middle class values and practices. So that's an issue because different people groups conceptualize childhood differently. They discipline their children differently. They teach their children different things based on their cultural truths and their experiences, which often are not the same as the experiences and values and behavior of the dominant culture. Okay, so the next reason why I believe that racism continues in the field of psychology is because up to this point, there has been a lack of accountability for psychologists. You know, because people of color are generally uninformed about the field of psychology in terms of how it operates, or because people of color have other priorities in terms of survival, they typically don't make formal ethical complaints to psychology governing boards. And when you don't make ethical complaints to either the psychologist licensing board or other governing boards, that means that psychologists are not going to be held formally accountable for their level of cultural competence. Another reason why racism has continued in the field of psychology is because of what I'm going to call implicit or unconscious bias. And this refers to the bias against people of color that dominant culture people have that they are not even aware of. I'm going to tell you that being a psychologist does not make us immune to the implicit bias of the dominant culture in terms of who is considered superior in American culture. Being a psychologist does not make us immune to the societal messages about who is dominant, who is better, whose value system is the one that should be upheld. And again, since psychologists are not held formally accountable, they also are not made to formally examine their own implicit biases and how these biases may impact the work that they do with people. Okay, the next reason why psychology still operates from a racist framework is because psychologists continue to have a lack of understanding of normal adaptations or normal variations between people groups. So for example, if we take intellectual functioning, since slavery times, Black people have not had adequate education. Back then in slavery times, it actually was illegal for Black people to be educated. And moving forward, Black people as a group still live in neighborhoods where the schools are subpar. So then it should not be surprising to people that Black people will score lower than the dominant culture on a lot of the IQ tests. Because IQ tests, again, are based upon the academic experiences and the academic richness, I'm going to say, of the schools of dominant culture individuals that most Black people do not have access to. So it's not because Black people are less, I'm going to say, genetically intelligent. I think a lot of the reasons why we score more poorly is because of our lack of academic exposure in terms of the schools that we go to. Another example of normal variations between people groups, when Black people and people of color are exposed to racism day in and day out and intergenerationally, there's a phenomenon known as racial trauma that we experience. And when Black people or people of color have experienced racial trauma, there are going to be behaviors that they demonstrate, like anger, like suspicion. And if you don't understand as a psychologist that these things are due to their racial trauma and are not due to mental health illnesses per se, you may erroneously diagnose them as having a mental illness, when in fact what the problem is their experience of racial trauma. Okay, now that I've given you some basics about differences between African Americans or people of color in the dominant culture group, I would like to talk with you about how you yourself might be able to challenge history if you or your loved ones have negative mental health evaluations. I think the first thing is that when you're being evaluated by a psychologist, you ought to talk with the psychologist about how racism interacts with whatever the life issue is that you're going through, so that they can begin to see that some of the issues and problems that you're having are not due necessarily to mental health issues, but they may be due to the interface of race and culture with whatever it is that's going on in your environment. The next way that you can challenge history is, if you feel that your psychological evaluation or treatment has been biased, you can make a formal complaint either to the agency or to the psychologist licensing board or to their state psychological association or to APA itself, because these agencies are supposed to have mechanisms to investigate grievances that people have about a lack of cultural competence on the part of a doctor. Okay, the next thing that you can do is you can actually ask the psychologist who wrote the report how specifically they took race and culture into account in their case conceptualization, in the recommendations that they gave, and in terms of their diagnosis. A doctor should be able to tell you how did they decide that whatever recommendation they made or whatever conceptualization they made, how did they decide that that was due to mental health issues as opposed to cultural or racial issues? And they ought to be able to have that conversation with you. And if they cannot, then that may mean that they are not operating from a culturally competent standpoint. Okay. Another thing that you can ask the doctor is, how might your specific conceptualization, diagnosis, or recommendations change if it was looked at from a racial or cultural perspective? Another thing that you can ask the doctor is what specifically has the doctor done to deal with their own cultural competence, and what specifically have they done to address their own implicit bias, not only in general, but also in terms of specifically how it relates to your case. Another thing that you can ask the provider is, how exactly did they incorporate the ethical principles and guidelines regarding race and culture into their work with you and into their report with you? They ought to be able to talk about how they incorporate those guidelines specifically. And again, if you need to get those guidelines, you can Google APA ethical guidelines for race and culture. Social workers have them, psychiatrists have them. They all probably have some ethical guidelines in relation to that you should familiarize yourself with before you ask the doctor that question. And again, you can file a complaint, as I said, with whoever the oversight agency is for the doctor, and then they should conduct an independent case review to see if the doctor's standards for cultural competence have been met. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that, you can also get a second opinion from a psychologist of color, show them the report that was written about you, and ask them if their conclusions would be the same or different from a cultural perspective. And you can Google any group of people for psychologists of color. So for example, you could Google the Association of Black Psychologists, the Association of Asian Psychologists, the Association of Latinx Psychologists, and then you ought to be able to get their web pages and find resources for doctors from those cultural perspectives. And so in closing, what I'd like to tell you is that psychology has helped millions of people over the course of history. But again, I want you to know that what is equally true is that it also has caused a lot of harm to people of color when it is not practiced in a culturally competent manner. And I want to thank you for taking this time to be with me today. And I'm hoping that some of the information that I gave you today is going to help you when you challenge history, when you find yourself in situations where psychological evaluations have been written against you that have been negative. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrea John Baptiste, and I am the host of Synergy Radio Show on WDJY FM in Atlanta, owned and operated by Hype Media Global. And I'm excited to share with you a little bit about, Jamaica and some things that you may not have known about Jamaican music, okay? So let's start off with a little bit about how Jamaica and Jamaica's music came to be. I'm a venerated music lover, an appreciator, and was raised in a home where music was created and consumed. There's still a studio in the home in which I grew up, a recording studio in Jamaica, and it's an active studio and recordings are still being made there. So preceding, many people know that Jamaica was a colony of Britain, right? But before that, we had indigenous people called the Arawaks, right? And the Spaniards, Christopher Columbus, and if you know that song, that's by Burning Spear, where he says, Christopher Columbus is a damn blasted liar, meaning you did not discover anything, right? Because the Arawaks were there. And unfortunately, the Spanish killed the Arawaks, and all that was left of that was the name Xaymaca, right? Or Xaymaca. And then came the Brits. and they trafficked, the Igbos from Lower Niger, the Coromantee, the Hausa Mandingo people from the Gold as well as the Ivory Coast, and Yoruba nations. So what we see is that a lot of Jamaica's history is steeped, right, in a lot of those African vestiges, right, from those ancestors. Because what would happen is that there would be these slave orchestras that would be convened by a lot of the wealthier plantation owners that would be used for entertainment. So they would bring these slaves together and allow them to utilize many of the instruments, maybe indigenous to where they were from, and of course some of the instruments that were, that the Brits actually utilized. At one point, drums were forbidden because those drums were used to communicate, not just entertain, but communicate messages for rebellion and revolution. It is also said that the bad slaves were sent to Jamaica. So there is this rebelliousness that you often see in our attitudes, but also in our music. There's a book called Reggae Bloodlines by Davis and Simon, and there's a study that they speak to from 1924 that demonstrates that rhythms, songs, dances that were purely African have survived into the 20th century. This study identifies works that from work and grave songs, right? From Africa that are particularly indigenous and utilized and well known in Jamaica's cockpit country. So you'll see that it includes like singing, antiphonal call responses, chanting, the repetition of short musical phrases. All of those from that 1924 study, the vestiges of slavery comes into the music that we hear coming out of Jamaica today. And so, one of the probably most visual things, if you are in Jamaica, or if you visit Jamaica frequently, particularly around the holidays, you may see John Canoe, right? Or John Canoe. And we see that around Christmas time, around the holidays in Jamaica. And while nobody is necessarily sure what the dance is about, we know that it's about magic, it's about spirit, right? And that is all directly traced back to the Zong Canoe of West Africa, right? Of the Iwe language. So we can see those direct vestiges in our music and in our culture even today. Kumina, part of a religion, dance, music, it was believed to be curative, right? And that also led to some of the sounds and beats and rhythms that we see out of Jamaica. Pocomania means a little madness, right? Where you have a lot of syncopated drumming, and it creates this trance-like effect. There was a Poco church not too far from my grandmother's house, and it always intrigued me because the rhythms were always so very, very strong. And so we see a lot of this, right, in modern day music. When we talk about Jamaican music, we're talking about mento, we're talking about pocomania, we're talking about kumina, we're talking about ska, we're talking about rock steady, rockers, reggae, lovers rock, dance hall, hip hop, reggaeton. And now I'm even understanding that there is dance hall trap. I honestly am not sure what that sounds like and what that is. I'll have to do a little bit more research, but it sounds interesting, right? And yes, hip hop, a derivative of reggae, started from Kool Herc, who was a Jamaican expat or Jamaican resident living in the States, right? And understood the toasting nature of the sound systems and replicated it. And it is now another huge international global genre. So Jamaica's music has had significant impact around the globe, and folks I think sometimes don't understand that all of these genres, it's said to be, that over 10 genres of music come out of Jamaica. And I mentioned several of them just now. world UNESCO City of Music status, right, since 2015, because Kingston not only is known for its unique sound system culture, which is what we talked about with the toasting and so on, that was brought into and helped to create hip hop, but Kingston also has the highest number of music recording studios per capita in the world. Amazing. So you can see the power of our music, right? And out of Kingston, it's being said that mento, ska, reggae, rocksteady, dub, and dancehall have emerged. So at least those 6 genres, and then there are others that I've talked about before as well. So we see that Jamaica's music is extremely impactful, right? We have the country has a population of like 3 million people, which is a third the population of London. And there's nowhere that you go in the world, and especially as a woman wearing locks, people will always see me in different remote places, and they say things like Bob Marley, right? One Love, and those are directly related to the impact of the music of Jamaica. Bob Marley, our best known face and musician, right? One Love, probably one of the global anthems for peace and unity, which came out of the bowels of Kingston and bringing political folks together. So we are very, very, very impactful in terms of reggae. It is the soul, it's our soul music, right? And so it's unique because we have accents on the second and the fourth beats, and the metric system is extremely unique. So seasoned drummers, it takes a seasoned drummer to be able to keep up with that. And until the 1950s, Jamaica's music was primarily mento, and it was considered to be, it's like an offshoot of calypso, and it was considered to be maybe dirty and often lewd, and sometimes sold under the counter, right? Pull it out, because hey, you can't have it there for everybody to listen to. And then with industrialization and the development of the transistor radio, there came this high consumption of R&B coming straight from Miami and New Orleans, because that's where the radio waves, the power of the radio waves, and we could hear some things coming out of like Cuba as well. But R&B was not played on Jamaica's conservative and government-owned and operated radio station. So then that brought forth the music entrepreneur, folks like the Soundmen, right? So Duke Reed, Sir Coxsone Dodge, Prince Buster, King Jabby, King Toby, right? They gave that process of evolution of hearing R&B, liking it, but not being able to get it locally, then created the sound system culture, right? Or the traveling discos, as they call them also. But that gave agency to this new level of industry, but also entrepreneurship. Then from that, we saw ska emerging, right? And that came as a slump in the R&B and pop in the 60s that was happening here. So the Soundmen then became promoters, and they started recording people because they couldn't get the music, right? So they started to create the music. And in 1964, Chris Blackwell, who was not famous or infamous at the time, right? He recorded Millie Small on the song My Boy Lollipop. Right? And that song was the first West Indian record to make it #1 on the British charts. And so that kind of was where Jamaica's music went to the world. So Jamaica music to the world. And that's supposed to be my Usain Bolt, thing, right? So, but as the industry emerged, somewhere in the mid to late 60s, rocksteady came out, which was a steadier dance beat, and it was now coupled with some of that consciousness and the social commentary that we were seeing, as there were also some socioeconomic things going on in Jamaica at that time. Then from that, reggae replaced rocksteady. So I'm giving you a little bit of the chronology, right? The word was first seen in 1967 on a song or an album by the Maytals, and the title was Do the Reggae, Reggay. And Toots Hibbert, who recently passed, who was the lead singer of the the Maytals, the band, it later became Toots and the Maytals, said that it meant majority. So this is the music that's coming out of the majority of the people here in Jamaica. So as that happened, you started to hear a lot of the sociocultural, political messages, some of the rebel music, right? And that then almost gave Jamaican musicians this role of prophets, because they were speaking of these things, but these things were happening, but now they had agency, they had a voice, right? And so they were able to put it on the vinyls and get it out there, probably even 8 tracks if my timing is right. So the artists were often rude boys that came out from the country, maybe coming to the city, trying to find work. At the time, I believe Jamaica's population unemployment was like 30%, so it was very high, very rough times. And so there was a lot of socioeconomic disarray. And around 1972, what we saw was that Rastafari really emerged into the music, and the thoughts, the teachings, the preachings of His Imperial Majesty came through, and the rebel and the consciousness, the rebelliousness, the wanting to praise a black god, and to burn down the vestiges of colonialism that were still there, really enhanced and spread a fire and a passion into the music. And so we then started to see roots reggae and the emergence of Bob Marley's, Dennis Brown, Burning Spear, and reggae started to really take its place on the world stage, particularly, I believe, because of the message, but also the timing. Around in the 80s, early 80s, around the time that Bob Marley passed away, we saw that reggae started to lose its popularity, right? And we started to see, a little bit more electronic stuff coming through, dance hall, hip hop, right? Dub. And then, again, we're now into the reggaeton, and like I mentioned, the trap, dance hall, and so on. So Jamaica's music has been extremely pervasive and influential around the world. The other thing that I'm hearing in the business now is about Afro beats. And when I think about it, and I hear the youngins talk about, all this cool stuff, Afro beats is where we started, right? We talked about the Karamanti music, we talked about, Yoruba, we talked about Hausa, I didn't even mention the Nyabingi drumming. So, but that is where it all started. We started from that, started from the African beats, now we hear it. Yes, okay. But so we've challenged the status quo, we've challenged classism, we've challenged colorism, we've challenged racism, we've challenged colonialism through the lyrics of reggae music, right? We have brought attention to some of the disparities, okay, in Jamaica, and to people of the African diaspora through the music, right? And as I just mentioned, Nyabingi in and of itself means death to black and white oppressors. It's also a song by Steel Pulse, right? So we're challenging death to black and white oppressors. So burning, as we say in Jamaica, burning a fire against oppression, right? We know the rebel music, the lyrics, get up, stand up for your rights, rebel music. So we see all kinds of progress happening through and by Jamaica's music. And a lot of it has to do with, and particularly giving agency to Rastafari, which as a group, spirituality, livity, or way of life, really was able to come to the forefront and have, like I said, have agency through the music. Still not necessarily mainstream acceptable back then, and even now, regrettably, but the music has been a conduit to a greater influence, exposure, knowledge, and understanding. So, we see that. On the flip side, some of the things that still I think need to be worked on when we talk about Jamaica's music, a formalized industry, right? We see fragments of things happening. There's a lot of great production, meaning things are great songs, great music, great sounds are being made in Jamaica. And a lot of it is being exported and it's being consumed overseas, and so on. But it's not, the returns on the investments are not going back to the island. So that is something that even though our music is powerful, our industry has not been as powerful and been there in support of the music as it should. The other thing that, unfortunately as a woman, I think there still is some gender disparities, and it's significant. In music, you can see the gaps they're pretty apparent, right? So you have these great and amazing women who have been part of the creation and the development of Jamaica's music for so long. Rita Marley, Bob Marley's wife, Judy Mowat, right? Marcia Griffith, the I3s. They made many inroad for women and for music, for Jamaica's music across the globe. Marcia Griffiths, the electric boogie, electric slide, right? Hola, hola, eh. It's easily one of the most recognized dance songs, and who doesn't know how to do the electric slide, right? And that came straight out of Jamaica. Sister Nancy, Bam Bam. It is said to be the most sampled reggae songs of all times, but it took a while for her to get her comeuppance, right? The song was being sampled and utilized without her permission for so long. Sister Carol, let's talk about Grammys. The category for Jamaica or for reggae, and it didn't start off as that, but it for reggae was actually 1985, and the winners were Black Uhuru. Love that group, one of my favorite groups of all time. In 1997, Sister Carol, another one of my favorites, Black Cinderella, was nominated. And then the next nomination was in 2019. The next female nomination was in 2019. And finally, in 2020, we had a win. Okay, I can't do the math and I don't want to do the math from 1985 to 2020, but that's a long time. Okay, for very small, a very limited number of female nominations. Okay, and one win in that time. The other thing, is the pay disparity. We still see that Jamaican female entertainers, singers are paid less, promoters, artist managers, than men. And then lastly, of course, some of the sexually disparate treatment that women often experience, meaning that they're propositioned in many cases, and things of that nature. And we see a lot of that discussion happening now, because with Me Too movement and women coming out and saying no more, we see many of the female reggae artists speaking a lot about this. But as you can see, Jamaica's music has had we have a rich cultural history, a rich cultural musical history, and we have great music of so many genres coming out of Jamaica to be enjoyed. There are wonderful positives, but certainly some things that we do need to work on. And if you're looking for great resources on Jamaica's music, I will say Reggae Bloodlines by Stephen Davis, Reggae, The Story of Jamaican Music by Lloyd Bradley, Solid Foundation, An Oral History of Reggae by David Katz, and Reggae Roadblock by Lloyd Stanbury. Those are exceptional tools. I have them on my desk, and I refer to them often when I have things like this to do. And so I thank you.